Hello, and welcome to another edition of Unlock the Door Radio here on UCY TV Productions, where we like to dig a little deeper than what you normally see in the mainstream media. And of course, we deal with such issues as psychology, media, social psychology, but also topics dealing with such things as the future when it comes to such things as biotechnology. And that brings me to tonight's topic. Now, I was looking around and found an article in the UK Independent, and it was about Professor Henry Greely from the Center for Law and Biosciences. And he's, as I said, Stanford University professor dealing with the ethical, legal, and social implications of fields such as neuroscience, genetics, and STEM research, and basically what's, in reference to the future of such things as reproduction. In fact, he's written a book called The End of Sex and the Future of Human Reproduction. Wow, that is a very intriguing title. Sure catches your attention. Could you tell us more, Professor Greely?
Sure, happy to. The title was supposed to catch people's attention. I hope it'll get people interested in the book. The argument in the book is that in 20 to 40 years, most babies around the world will be conceived not in bed, but in a clinic. Parents will make up to 100 embryos. Each of those embryos will receive whole genome sequence testing, and the parents will then choose which one or two embryos they want to try to move in to the woman's womb in order to start a pregnancy and hopefully provide a child. The procedure involved actually isn't new. It's something called Preimplantation genetic diagnosis. It's been around since 1990. Last year in the United States, about 4,000 children were born after having their genes checked when they were 3 to 5 day old embryos. But two things are changing to make this much more common. One is, instead of just looking at one or two genes, we will be able soon, with in a very cheap and fast way, to look at the entire genome sequence, which will tell us everything genetics can tell us about each of those embryos. Everything genetics can tell us isn't as much as most people think it is, but it's still a fair amount about rare diseases, common diseases, cosmetics, a little bit about behavioral traits, and then something many parents are very interested in, boy or girl. The other advance comes from stem cell research. The rate-limiting factor right now with preimplantation genetic diagnosis, or PGD, is that you have to do IVF, in vitro fertilization. And to do in vitro fertilization, you've got to get eggs. Getting sperm is easy. Getting eggs is really expensive, unpleasant, and somewhat risky. In the future, we will be able to take skin cells, turn them into what are called induced pluripotent stem cells. That part we can already do. And then turn those induced pluripotent stem cells into eggs and, when necessary, sperm. So, couple in 20 to 40 years will go to the clinic. He will give a sperm sample. She will give a little skin sample, about a 2-millimeter punch biopsy, covered over with a Band-Aid, doesn't even need a stitch. Her skin cells will be turned into these stem cells, these iPSCs, induced pluripotent stem cells, which will be turned into eggs. They'll make about 100 embryos. The embryos will each get completely genetically tested, and the parents will then be given whatever information they want and be told, okay, tell us which one or two you want to transfer. That's the scenario I see coming. The book is devoted to explaining why that sort of counterintuitive scenario, that thing that sounds like Brave New World or Gattaca, actually probably will happen, and then what things we should worry about when it does.
Well, there's a couple things that brought up in my mind there. One is that first of all, this is different than eugenics in the sense that this is actually taking the couple and letting them select, like if they were to, in theory, hypothetically, produce 100 children, obviously there would be a certain range of kids. There'd be some that would be, some would wind up with the genes that would make them tall. Even if 90 of them were short, there'd be a few that would be tall. Some might have, super intelligence. And so they'd be able to choose these characteristics. They'd be able to say, well, I want this kid here that's going to have red hair, it's going to be female, and she's going to have an IQ of 130. Is that what you're saying?
Maybe. So whether it's different from eugenics or not depends a lot on your definition of eugenics. I happen to agree with you because I think we should restrict eugenics to state-compelled reproductive decisions, where the government says you may not reproduce, or if you reproduce, you may not make these choices. But there are people who will say that the future I sketch out is one of parental eugenics or familial eugenics. The other qualification I'd put to what you'd said is that, you won't necessarily get the perfect child. What you can get genetically depends on what you and your spouse have to give. So two people who are both blood type O are going to get a blood type O kid this way. They're not going to get a blood type A kid. Two people who are very short might be able to pick the tallest of 100 children, but that tallest of 100 embryos is not likely to grow up to be a 7-footer. Even if you both have genetic variations that might work out, if you're making 100, there are 23,000 genes, and the chance of getting the right variations on all of those genes, the variations you would most prefer by making only 100 or even 1,000 embryos, is not very big. So it's not designer babies. You're not going to be able to say, I want this, 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 and this. Instead, you'll get a choice. Here are 100 embryos. Here are the characteristics that their genes tell us they're likely to have. Pick the one you like best.
Now, a side issue, this would actually work for same-sex couples, too. I mean, two women could, using stem cells, be able to have a baby together.
We don't know for sure. I think that's likely to happen. Making eggs and sperm out of skin cells has already successfully been done with mice, and mouse babies have been born. The first steps have been taken in that direction with humans, though no one has made the final egg or sperm. Whether you could make sperm or sperm enough like things from female cells, or egg enough like things to be useful from male cells isn't clear, but the people I talk to seem to think that that's quite likely. The only tricky part would be if two women wanted to have a boy, somewhere you'd have to come up with and add a Y chromosome to the mix. But other than that, yes, I think one of the sets of people who will be most excited about this technology will be gay and lesbian couples who would like to have children they're genetically related to, and this gives them for the first time a chance to have a kid that is genetically all theirs.
Mm-hmm. Now, another interesting aspect is, now you deal with society too, and you're feeling that, do you have the feeling that at first the technology will become available, but it'll take a little while for people to start adapting to it, but then eventually it might get to that point where maybe someone would actually start thinking that having sex the regular way to make a baby would be similar to how we react sometimes when we hear about people not vaccinating their children. They might think it's irresponsible not to go to the doctor.
That's a possibility. Remember, though, it's important to distinguish between having sex to conceive children and having sex. I don't think having sex is going to go away, despite the somewhat provocative title of the book. We're still going to have lots of sex. We just won't use it very often to make our children. I hope, and this is one of the key points the book explores, I hope we never allow people to be forced to use this technology. I think they should have the choice to roll the dice with respect to their baby's genes, but it is something that different societies may well react differently to.
Mm-hmm. What would you see the pattern being? I mean, if you look to the future, okay? I mean, it sounds like, Ray Kurzweil, he looks to the future of applied technologies when it comes to computers and interfaces with humans. But you're looking to the future when it comes to the genetics and the legal aspects and things. Give me kind of a breakdown of how you feel things will be done you give me a little bit already, how things will be done in 2035, and then how they'll be done in 2065 or 2085 or whatever. How things are going to progress in this.
Sure. I've set my prediction at 20 to 40 years out. 2035 would be a little bit short of that. But let me push it back to about 2045 or 2050, when I think what I call easy PGD is likely to be in widespread use. By the way, one thing I learned in writing this book is if you're going to make a really bold prediction, it's a good idea to set its end date beyond your life expectancy. Because in 2050, I would be 98. So I don't really expect to see 2050, but that means I can't be proven wrong, at least not to myself. Anyway, I suspect that by 2050, in say the United States, 70, 80% of babies will be conceived this way. They won't all be. Sometimes people will have religious objections or philosophical objections. Sometimes they'll just think it's more romantic to conceive the old-fashioned way. And sometimes teenagers will get pregnant in the backseat of a car because they're teenagers. So I don't think it'll ever be 100%. I think some societies will adopt it more quickly than others. East Asian societies, I suspect, will find this very attractive. The Vatican City is unlikely to legalize it anytime soon. Some of the more conservative Catholic countries, I think, will have less uptake, but still some. As a result, we're not going to see super babies. Again, it's sort of, I don't want to say garbage in, garbage out, but you only get out what you can put in. And two people having a baby together, they may get a better version of one of the better versions of their possible offspring, but they're not going to be super kids. They'll be 10 to 20% healthier. Maybe they'll be a little smarter. There'll be a little bit, their cosmetic traits in parents who decide to select cosmetic traits will be a little more in line with what the parents want. That could lead to issues of homogenization of looks, although I think tastes are different enough that not everybody's going to end up looking like, name your favorite male and female actresses. And I think that's going to be the dominant way people in rich countries will have kids. It will be dominant. It'll start slowly. I think the process will actually first be used not for genetic purposes at all, but to let people who are infertile because they can't make eggs or sperm, people who had an early disease or an accident or a birth defect, have children. Making eggs and sperm through stem cells lets them have children. I think that's what the FDA will approve it for, but once it's approved for one thing by the FDA, doctors can use it for anything else. Now, there are a couple of other alternatives out there in reproduction. One that I think is now much more likely to be ready by 2050 than I did 4 years ago is gene editing. What I'm talking about in the end of sex is embryo selection. Gene editing is actually talking about more designing babies or editing babies, editing embryos' genomes. There's a new technology called CRISPR that has taken the biological world by storm that makes editing genomes much, much faster, cheaper, easier, and more accurate. So by 2050, there may be some start to using gene editing to make children. That way, the two parents who have type O blood could have a kid with type A blood, or two parents who are blonde could have a dark-haired kid. I think the safety issues about that are larger. It's likely to be delayed beyond embryo selection, but by 2050 that may be starting. I also suspect that by then we will be able to clone human babies. My guess is that's going to be a minority taste. Most people who want something different, want to make a mix of two people, but I suspect there will be some babies alive who are clones. Once the people who clone them realize how different the babies actually turn out to be from whoever they were cloned from, I think that possibility is likely to recede some. So I see a future with with a number of different ways of making babies, but with a shift driven really by the health issues more than anything else, by the desire of parents to have healthy babies. the desire to avoid the 6,000 or 7,000 known nasty genetic diseases that can be predicted through this method. They only add up to 1 to 2% of babies, but you don't want to have, if you can avoid it, you would rather avoid it, having a baby with that, with one of those problems. So that's where I see the future in 2050. In 2100, God knows.
Mm-hmm. Well, thinking about this, if you think from the long term, I did read an article about some research that was being done in China where they were talking about this very thing, and they were saying that maybe in one generation, let's say the parents have an IQ of 100, the standard IQ, but then they choose a kid who has an IQ of 110, and then that kid marries someone who has 110 IQ, but then they choose a kid that has 115, and after a few generations, you could then wind up with what we would now consider super intelligence and stuff. But, isn't that possible?
Possible, but I think unlikely. Unlikely in part because intelligence is really complicated. Hell, we don't even really know what it is or how many different things it is. I was lucky enough to be a law clerk to Justice Potter Stewart, who's mainly remembered for saying about obscenity that he can't define it, but he knows it when he sees it. Intelligence is kind of the same thing. And one thing we know plenty of genes that when broken cause very, very low intelligence. We know almost nothing about genetic variations that give people higher intelligence. So I think even in 20 to 40 years, the best we're going to be able to do is to say to somebody, well, this embryo has a 60% chance of being in the top half. This embryo has a 40% chance of being in the top half. This embryo has a 13% chance of being in the top 10%. If you do that long enough, yes, the IQs should increase, but it's not likely to be dramatic unless we learn a heck of a lot more than we currently know about what intelligence is and how it comes about. 50 years from now, presumably we will know a lot more about it. Although, one of the areas I work in is neuroscience. Brain is awfully complicated, and an awful lot of it has to do with experiences and chance, not just genetics. So super intelligence, I think, is not likely to come out of this. Somewhat higher intelligence generation after generation, I think, is likely. But the funny thing is, and most people don't realize this, it's something called the Flynn effect. IQs have gone up around the rich world by about 20 points in the last 70 years. They go up a few points a decade. We don't really know why. So we actually supposedly are about 20 IQ points smarter than our grandparents and great-grandparents were in 1940 without genetic testing.
Okay. Maybe that's because, just more people get educations and therefore they do better on the test. Couldn't that be a possibility?
People are looking at all sorts of possible explanations for the Flynn effect. I think that's one, that people are better at taking tests. They're more used to it. But another one is there's better nutrition. There are fewer childhood diseases. There are fewer children born with mental retardation or intellectual disabilities because of prenatal testing, among other things. So we don't really know. I like to think that adding 10 or 20 IQ points to the population as a whole would be a good thing. I think intelligent people like to think that intelligence is useful. Not sure that's really true, but we're likely to test it out. Mm-hmm. I don't, in my heart, believe that my generation is that much smarter than the generation that survived the Depression and won World War II. But on IQ tests, we seem to be.
Yeah, this thing with CRISPR, do you think that, there will be, like you said, there will be East Asian countries that'll grab onto this first? I know right now China is really researching this kind of stuff. And could we have a thing like you could have like fertility tourism is today? There's countries, for instance, like England that has a lot of restrictions on egg and sperm donation. And it's not anonymous, so some people don't like the fact that someone can call them when they reach 18 and say, hey, dad, or hey, mom. So many British couples go to Denmark, they have different laws. And, they get themselves a Viking father for their baby and stuff. But could you see that happening with biotech in this area?
Oh, sure. I mean, I think it's almost certain. Countries are likely to have somewhat different laws. And in that case, it's going to be really hard to keep parents from going to a clinic someplace else in a different country to have embryos made and genetic tests done. The woman gets pregnant in California rather than home in Germany. What are the Germans going to do about it? So I think reproductive tourism is a major problem for any country that wants to implement a restrictive regime on this. Any country, or in the U.S. context, any state.
How do you think corporations are there going to be corporations that are going to get involved in this to where now it doesn't seem that we'd really have that? I mean, with fertility clinics, for instance, they tend to be a lot of them, a lot of variety of what prospective parents are looking for. Could you see this becoming something that corporations invest in so they can, you actually have, fertility markets and stuff?
Possibly. I mean, babies are us, embryos are us. I could see chains perhaps coming up. I don't think you're likely to get a lot of concentration unless there are powerful patents. I don't talk, I think, at all in the book about patents. I think patents are unlikely to be a big player in this particular issue, in part because I'm not sure that patents would be granted for things involving making babies. That's going to make a lot of countries very nervous. But more importantly, because I think this will take long enough, the safety testing and the regulatory procedures will take long enough that any patents that are granted are likely to expire before it really gets moving. I think fertility right now in the U.S., there are about 160 to 180,000 cycles of IVF treatment a year across 600 fertility clinics. There are about 4 million babies born a year. If instead of 160,000 cycles a year, there were 3 million cycles a year, you'd certainly have to build a much bigger fertility industry. And at that point, outside capital might get involved in a way that it hasn't. The clinics thus far have tended to be either associated with hospitals, particularly academic centers, or individual physicians. So yeah, it could turn into a bigger business.
You mentioned that you've got some experience with, the courts and stuff. Where do you see our laws, both in the United States and maybe at least the Western world, going in regards to this technology as it comes along? How is this going to cause a new evolution, per se, of how we look at both what is life, what is parents, what are parental responsibilities, and so forth?
Well, I think for the most part, we're well down that pathway between donor eggs, donor sperm, surrogacy. That's been around for 30 years or more. And I don't know that any place has really figured it out perfectly, but we've been muddling through pretty well in terms of trying to resolve those rights and duties. This just makes it potentially, I don't think this really adds much to that set of issues. It's really more going to be a question of will some countries or states choose to allow this procedure for some purposes, for all purposes, or for no purposes. And I think there will be variation there, and that will lead, at least in the United States and in many other countries, to some really interesting constitutional questions about whether the state has the power to regulate parental decision about making babies. In the U.S., at least with respect to abortion, the state has limited power there. With respect to contraception, the state has very limited power there. Would those kinds of constitutional precedents be applied here? It'd be really interesting to see.
Okay. I was just thinking about this here. Do you see this as actually the next logical step of like an industrial revolution, that we are actually turning our technology now to fitting, creating people that will fit into the society in ways that, normally we look at consumer products. I mean, I think that's going to be one of the arguments, from the people who are what you might call more natural when it comes to this.
Yeah, I mean, maybe. I think that's a difference between embryo selection and designer babies and embryo engineering. You're not going to be able to pick a perfect baby. You're not going to be able to say, I want the model that has the, red leather seats and a convertible top and white wall tires and a V6 engine. When you get into gene editing, that may be more likely. Here there's still a huge role for chance. You're just picking what you like best out of the 100 or so that chance throws up. But more fundamentally, I'm a parent myself. Trying to mold our children is something that we've done for a long time. That's what education's about. That's what early child rearing is about. That's what trying to have pregnant women eat healthily and avoid dangerous things is about. I think this is another step in what's been going on for a long time of trying to have healthier children. These are healthier children that their parents think they will like better. That's a little bit of a change. Although I don't know any parent, including certainly myself, my wife, who thinks their children turned out exactly the way they expected. This is not going to change that. Our children will still surprise us in many, many ways, just not quite as many as they did before.
Yeah, I mean, to me, it doesn't. I don't think we're quite to the level of being able to tell, or correct me if I'm wrong, that which child's going to be born with a love of music versus a love of math, or is going to be a better speaker, or wind up being a good politician. We're not quite there yet, are we?
No, we're nowhere close to there, and we may never get there. And genes are important, but they're not everything. Environment and chance plays a huge role in most things. What this will be good for, there are about 6,000 early childhood genetic diseases that are very powerfully genetic. This can tell you your kid will not get one of those. There are a whole bunch of other diseases that are influenced to some extent by your genes, including breast cancer, colon cancer, Alzheimer's disease. This will be able to improve your risks. Cosmetic things like hair color, skin color, eye color, we don't know much about yet, but we will. You'll be able to do better that way. We'll be able to say, well, this baby's hair, this embryo's hair would turn out to be a blondish, a dark blonde shade, somewhere between numbers 115 and 121 on this graph, on this sheet. And we'll be able to tell you a little bit about behavioral traits, but frankly, I don't think very much. One thing we'll be pretty good about is being able to tell you boy or girl. But we're not going to be able to tell you what kind of boy or what kind of girl. So I don't think it's going to be, genetics isn't as all-encompassing as people think it is for the most part. If you're one of the people who's born with two genes that give you Tay-Sachs disease, genes are destiny. You will not see your fifth birthday. But for most of us, for 95% of us, genes are an influence. They're not really destiny.
Okay, that's a very profound statement there. We're coming up on the last couple minutes here. Tell me a little bit about, just basically, tell the audience why they should read your book and should learn more about what is coming in the future, and then also how they can get a copy.
So let me answer this phone call first. Hey, Greely. Hey, Nick, can you call me in 5 minutes? Thanks. I'm sorry, repeat the question.
Okay, first let the listening audience know why they should pick up your book and get a glimpse of the future, and also how they can get a copy of your book.
Sure. I think this is both really fascinating stuff and important. It's important to the future of our civilization, the future of our species. But maybe more importantly, it's important to each one of us as a potential parent or grandparent or great-grandparent. This is about things that make humans what we are. The genetics is fascinating, but as complicated as genetics is, the social, legal, and ethical settings that the genetics works on are even more complicated. Law and genetics actually remind me of each other very heavily. They're both really complicated. They've got a lot of rules. Every rule has an exception, and every exception has an exception to the exception. So it's intellectually fascinating. It's important. And it's mind-stretching. I really enjoyed writing the book. I don't know whether I'll be right in the future I foresee, but I am pretty confident that people who read it will have a better grasp of what possibilities are coming. Something's happening. The world is changing with respect to reproduction, and the book will give you a really strong background on that. The book is published by Harvard University Press. I wish I could say that it's on newsstands and in airports everywhere. I don't think that's right, but it's certainly carried online. Amazon.com carries it. Harvard University Press carries it. Right now it's in both a Skype version and a hardback version. I hope at some point there's both an audio version and a paperback version, but those decisions haven't been made yet.
Okay, well, great. I would encourage people then to, check Amazon out, find out more about your book, and find out a little bit more about how, science and also society in general actually intersect. Thanks for coming on.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.